Most people who get deceived don't see it coming because they don't know enough. Dylan Patterson got deceived because he knew too much, and someone knew exactly how to use that against him. He had spent 40 years in medical research at Cambridge. He understood oncology, cardiology, rare disease pathways, surgical cost structures, hospital billing. He understood all of it, and for 2 years, a woman named Ophelia Reyes used every piece of that knowledge as a weapon not to confuse him, but to convince him. By the time he stopped writing checks, £465,000 was gone, and the thing that broke him most wasn't the money. It was the realization that his own life's work had been the key she used to open the door. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October, and I remember exactly where I was when I answered it. Standing at my kitchen window in Cambridge, looking out at the garden that had gone a little wild since my wife Anne passed, holding a mug of tea that had gone cold while I stood there thinking about nothing in particular. That was what my mornings had become in the 2 years since Anne died. Long, quiet, full of nothing in particular. Ophelia's voice was very controlled on the phone. That was the first thing I noticed. Controlled in the way that people are controlled when they are managing something frightening. She said her mother had been diagnosed 3 days ago, stage 3 ovarian cancer. The oncologist at the private clinic in Quezon City had recommended immediate surgery followed by 6 cycles of carboplatin and paclitaxel. She named the drugs precisely. She named the staging criteria precisely. She said the total cost of the treatment pathway, including the surgical admission, the chemotherapy suite fees, and the specialist consultations, had been estimated at the equivalent of £85,000. I said I would help. I want to stop at that sentence for a moment because it is the most important sentence in this entire story, and I said it in about 4 seconds. I said it before I asked for documentation, before I asked which clinic, before I asked for the oncologist's name or the histology report or the staging scan results. Before I did any of the things that 40 years of medical research had trained me to do before accepting a clinical claim. I said it because I loved her, and because I understood every word she had just said, and the understanding felt like verification, and it was not. That is the whole thing, really. That 1 4-second decision is the whole thing. Everything else is just the landscape around it. I need to go back to the beginning, because the beginning explains why those 4 seconds happened the way they did. I met Ophelia 14 months before that phone call. She was a medical assistant at a private clinic in Quezon City. That was how she described herself, and that was what she was, a trained and competent medical professional who handled patient coordination, assisted with procedures, managed clinical records. She was 36. I was 71. I had come to Manila for a 6-week stay that had stretched to 3 months and then to 6, because the city had done something to me that I hadn't expected and couldn't entirely explain. I had retired from the Medical Research Council in Cambridge the previous year, after 4 decades of laboratory and field research in oncology and infectious disease. I had published widely. I had supervised doctoral students who had gone on to careers I was proud of. I had spent my professional life in the careful, methodical, evidence-based pursuit of knowledge. And it had been a good life, a meaningful one. And when Anne died, it had also become, suddenly and completely, the only thing I had left. She died of pancreatic cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to the end, I knew, from my own professional knowledge, almost exactly what was coming at each stage. There is a particular cruelty to that kind of expertise when it is applied to someone you love. You cannot deceive yourself about prognosis. You cannot hope past the data. You sit with your wife in the oncology ward of Addenbrooke's and you understand precisely what the consultant means when he uses the phrases he uses. And your understanding is not comfort, it is just early arrival at a destination everyone else reaches later. I went to Manila because my son James, who lives in Singapore, suggested I spend some time in Southeast Asia. He said the warmth would help. He said he'd seen it help other people who'd been through loss. He said it with the careful, deliberate kindness of a son who doesn't know what else to say but wants very much to say something useful. I went because I couldn't think of a reason not to, and that is as much agency as grief sometimes permits. I found Manila overwhelming and then, over weeks, compelling. The density of it, the noise, the way that every street contained an entire economy operating at close quarters, food being cooked, goods being traded, conversations being conducted at volumes that assumed the world was listening. After Cambridge, after the quiet garden and the cold tea and the nothing in particular, the sensory overload was almost physical relief. A friend in Cambridge, a former colleague named Professor Whitmore, who had spent 2 years doing health research in the Philippines, had given me contact details for people he knew there. One of them was a doctor who ran a small private clinic in Quezon City, a Dr. Bernardo, a decent and serious man who was involved in community health initiatives that my former institution had peripherally supported. I visited the clinic, met Dr. Bernardo, and through that visit met Ophelia, who was coordinating patient records on the afternoon I came by. She was precise and professional and asked me 2 questions about my research background that showed she had a genuine interest in clinical science beyond the administrative work she was doing. She understood what a randomized controlled trial was. She understood what a meta-analysis meant. She asked about the oncology side of my career with a curiosity that seemed real, and it was, I believe, to this day that her interest in medicine was genuine, which made everything she did with it later more complex to untangle than a simple fraud. We met for coffee the following week, then for dinner, then, over the months that followed, for the kind of long, meandering conversations about medicine and science and life and loss that I had not had with anyone since Anne. She had a quality of attention that I found rare. She listened in a way that made you feel that what you were saying was being properly filed away, thought about, connected to other things she knew. She asked about Anne. She asked about the pancreatic cancer not invasively, carefully, with the clinical sensitivity of someone who works with patients and understands how illness lands in the people around it. She said she had seen families devastated by cancer diagnoses in her work at the clinic. She said she sometimes wondered whether all the treatment options in the world made any real difference to the suffering. It was a question I had asked myself professionally for decades, and hearing it from her felt like being understood in a language most people didn't speak. I was not naive about the age gap or the cultural distance. I had friends who had warned me, in the cautious, well-meaning way that people warn those they care about. Professor Whitmore sent me a careful email in February of that year that said, essentially, that he hoped I was being thoughtful. James called me from Singapore with slightly less subtlety and asked directly whether I was sure about what I was getting into. I told him I was an adult who had spent 40 years evaluating evidence before drawing conclusions. He said that was fair and left it there. The relationship deepened over those 14 months before the first phone call. We met twice a week, sometimes more. I met members of her family on 3 occasions, her mother, a small, warm woman in her late 60s who received me with a kind of formal courtesy that I respected, her younger sister, her cousin. They seemed real. They were real. I have thought about this carefully since. The family was not fabricated. The family existed. What was fabricated was what happened to them. £85,000. Went to the clinic account Ophelia gave me within 3 days of the first phone call. She had the account details ready. She had a payment reference that corresponded to a patient identifier, her mother's initials, and a clinic code. She sent me the intake documentation, a clinical summary on letterhead that looked exactly like clinical letterhead, a treatment plan that used correct oncological staging language, a cost breakdown that mapped precisely to what private oncology treatment in a Philippine clinic would actually cost. I verified the letterhead against Dr. Bernardo's clinic format, which I had seen before. It matched. I did not call the clinic directly to verify the admission. I did not ask to see the histology report underlying the staging assessment. I did not ask for the radiologist's name on the CT scan that had identified the mass. I checked the cost figures against my professional knowledge of what such treatment would run in a private Southeast Asian facility, and they were consistent, and I treated consistency as confirmation. It was not confirmation. Consistency with genuine costs means only that someone has researched genuine costs, which takes approximately 45 minutes online. She sent me photographs 2 weeks into the treatment. Her mother in a hospital bed, clearly unwell, clearly in a clinical setting, with an IV line and monitoring equipment visible. A nurse I didn't recognize in the frame. Ophelia sitting beside the bed holding her mother's hand. The images were distressing and real-looking, and I felt, looking at them, the particular helplessness that anyone feels when they see someone they care about suffering at a distance they cannot close. I did not know, at the time, whether those photographs were of her actual mother or of someone else. I still don't know. The investigation that came later found evidence of at least one staged photograph, but the family was real and her mother did have some health issues in the period, which I suspect was not coincidence. The choice of timing may have been calculated to provide an authentic backdrop. What I know with certainty is that no £85,000 went to an oncology treatment pathway. The clinic account she gave me was not a clinic account. The money moved into a personal account structure and was dispersed before any formal investigation began. I didn't know any of that yet. In the weeks following the transfer, I received updates. Treatment was progressing. Her mother was tolerating the chemotherapy reasonably well. There were difficult days. Ophelia called sometimes at night when she was sitting with her in the hospital, and she sounded tired and frightened and grateful for the phone call, and I listened and said things I hoped were useful, and I felt the useless, burning helplessness of someone watching illness from far away, which I had felt for 14 months with Anne and which I was apparently willing to feel again without question. The second emergency arrived 4 months later. Her father. Cardiac event, a significant NSTEMI, she said. Non-ST elevation myocardial infarction. She used the correct acronym without explanation, the way clinicians do. The cardiology team at the private hospital had recommended a catheterization and likely stenting, possibly a bypass procedure depending on what the angiogram showed. She quoted the ejection fraction from the echocardiogram. She described the degree of arterial stenosis in terms that were clinically coherent. She named the interventional cardiologist who had taken the case. £95,000. This time I asked more questions. Not enough, but more. I asked which hospital. She named a real hospital in Metro Manila, one I could look up, and did. I asked about the cardiologist's name. She gave me a name I could not verify independently because I didn't know the Philippine medical register well enough to search it quickly, and I told myself I'd look into it, and then I didn't, because she called me the next morning sounding frightened and said her father's condition had deteriorated overnight and the procedure needed to be moved up and the deposit was required before the surgical team could be confirmed. I transferred £95,000 within 48 hours of the first conversation. I remember sitting at my desk in Cambridge on the morning of the second transfer, feeling something in the back of my mind that I would describe now as a shape without a name, not alarm exactly, not suspicion exactly, something with the texture of a question I had not quite asked. I sat with it for a few minutes and then I thought about a man I had never met lying in a hospital in Manila with arterial disease, and I thought about Anne and Addenbrooks, and I made the transfer. The thing without a name. I have spent a great deal of time since then sitting with that thing and trying to understand why I didn't let it become a question. The best I can do is this. It felt disloyal to ask. Not practically disloyal, not a calculation about what Ophelia would think if I demanded documentation before helping her father. Emotionally disloyal. As if asking for evidence before acting on a medical emergency was a statement about where my priorities lay. As if, on some level, I had decided that being the man who helps without hesitation was more important to me than being the man who verifies before acting. That decision, dressed up in the language of love and urgency, cost me £95,000 in 4 seconds. Again, James called me in the spring. He had come to Manila to visit for a week, which he did twice a year, and on the third evening we had dinner at a restaurant near my apartment in BGC, and he said, very carefully, that he wanted to ask me something. How much have you given Ophelia's family? He said. I told him the 2 amounts. He was quiet for a long moment. Dad, he said. Have you seen any documentation? Medical records? Receipts from the hospitals? Anything independent? She sent me clinical summaries, I said. Clinical summaries she prepared? I looked at my glass. Or from the hospitals directly. The format is consistent with Dad. He said it gently, but with the particular firmness that James has always had, even as a boy. Have you been to the Philippines to see any of this? Have you spoken to any of the doctors directly? I had not been back to Manila since the first emergency. The trips had been difficult to arrange. I had been in the middle of a visiting fellowship at the MRC and the schedule had been complicated. I had told myself I would visit when the acute phase had passed. You need to go, James said. You need to go, and you need to ask for documentation from the institutions themselves, not through Ophelia. I said I would. I said it fully, intending to follow through. 3 weeks later, the third emergency arrived. Her sister, a rare autoimmune condition, she named it correctly, the full clinical designation. Systemic lupus erythematosus with renal involvement, confirmed by anti-DNA titers, and a kidney biopsy showing class 4 nephritis. She named the nephrologist. She described the treatment protocol: hydroxychloroquine, high-dose corticosteroids, and mycophenolate mofetil for the immune modulation. She quoted the creatinine clearance from the most recent renal function panel. She said the specialist center in Manila that could manage this level of nephritis was expensive but had the best outcomes data in the country. 110,000 pounds. Every word was correct. Class IV lupus nephritis is genuinely serious. The treatment protocol she described was current and evidence-based. The cost she quoted for specialist management at a private tertiary center in Manila was in the range I would have estimated from my own knowledge of regional healthcare costs. There was not a single clinical detail she got wrong. I transferred the money within a week. James called when I told him. He was not angry. He was something quieter than anger, something that sounds like a person choosing their words with exceptional care because they know the wrong ones will cause damage that can't be undone. Dad, he said, 300,000 pounds in less than a year. I know what it sounds like, I said. It sounds like you've been paying for 3 separate serious medical crises in one family in 12 months. Serious illness clusters in families, I said. There's substantial epidemiological evidence for shared genetic and environmental risk factors. Dad, he stopped me, quietly but completely. I know that, and you know I know that. I'm not questioning the medicine. I'm asking whether you've verified that any of this is actually happening. The silence on my end was very long. I need you to go to Manila, he said. I'll come with you next month. We'll go together and we'll ask to see the records directly from the hospitals and we'll speak to the doctors by name. Can we do that? I said yes. We set a date 5 weeks out, and I did not tell Ophelia we were coming. The fourth emergency arrived before we could travel. Her grandmother, 83 years old, emergency admission for a complicated abdominal presentation that had been investigated by CT and found to be a perforated diverticulum with localized peritonitis. Surgery was needed immediately. The colorectal surgeon had already assessed and the operating theater was available the following morning, but the deposit 75,000 pounds was required by 5 o'clock that afternoon to secure the bed and the surgical team. 5 o'clock that afternoon. I sat in my Cambridge study for 2 hours after that call. I sat with the amount and the timeline and the feeling of 5 weeks being reduced to 1 afternoon, and I thought about an 83-year-old woman with peritonitis, and I thought about the fact that I had not yet seen a single piece of documentation that hadn't come through Ophelia's hands, and I thought about what James had said and the date we had set and the question I still had not fully let myself ask. I called James. Don't send it, he said immediately, before I had finished describing the situation. Don't send a penny. Not until we get there and verify everything. She's saying the surgery needs to happen tomorrow, I said. Dad, listen to me. If her grandmother genuinely has peritonitis and genuinely needs emergency surgery, that surgery is going to happen regardless of a deposit from a foreign national. Hospitals in Manila do not let elderly patients die of peritonitis because a foreigner hasn't wired funds. This is not how medical emergencies work." I knew he was right. I had known it the moment the words came out of her mouth. Because I had spent 40 years in medical research and I knew how hospital admission worked, and the scenario she was describing, a same-day surgical deposit deadline with a 5-hour window, was not a clinical reality. It was a sales structure. I transferred the money anyway. I transferred it because I sat with the alternative, the possibility that she was telling the truth, and I had withheld help from a dying 83-year-old woman over a question about documentation, and I could not hold that possibility. It was too close to another thing I carried, too close to the feeling of sitting with Anne and knowing the data and being unable to change the outcome. The two things fused in some way I couldn't separate in that moment, and I paid £75,000 to keep them from touching. James called me back the next morning. He knew I had sent it before I told him. I could hear it in the first 2 seconds of the call. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "We're going in 2 weeks, not 5, 2. And you're not sending anything else before we get there. Can you give me your word on that?" I gave him my word. We landed in Manila on a Tuesday evening. James had done preparation I hadn't expected. He had engaged a Manila-based due diligence firm that worked with foreign nationals, a small professional outfit that had experience investigating medical fraud claims. He had briefed them before our arrival. He told me about it on the flight, and I felt something that was complicated to name. Gratitude, shame, the particular deflation of a parent being protected by their child. We did not contact Ophelia before arriving. We went first to the clinic where her mother had supposedly been treated for ovarian cancer. Dr. Bernardo's clinic, where I'd met Ophelia, where the letterhead on the first clinical summary had matched, Dr. Bernardo himself received us. He was courteous and slightly puzzled. There was no record of Ophelia's mother as a patient, ever. The patient identifier on the clinical summary, I showed him the initials and clinic code that had appeared on the payment reference I'd used for the first transfer, didn't correspond to any record in their system. He looked at the letterhead carefully and said, quietly, that it was his clinic's letterhead but not a document his clinic had produced. He could tell, he said, from details in the formatting that someone familiar with the clinic's documents had replicated the style without access to the actual template. Close, not exact. The hospital where her father had supposedly undergone cardiac intervention had no record of the procedure or the patient. The specialist center where her sister had been treated for lupus nephritis had no record of the admission. The private hospital for the grandmother's emergency surgery, no record. James sat beside me through each of these conversations and said very little. He didn't need to say anything. The information was doing all the talking that needed to be done. The due diligence firm had traced the destination accounts from the transfer records I had provided them. All 4 accounts had been opened within weeks of each transfer request and closed within days of receiving funds. The name on 2 of the accounts was not Ophelia's. The money had moved through a layered series of transfers that the firm described, with professional understatement, as consistent with deliberate dispersal rather than medical payment. I sat in the firm's small conference room in Makati on the second afternoon and looked at a printed summary of 4 pages that documented, item by item, what had actually happened. James sat beside me. He had his hands on the table in front of him, very still. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the document, giving me the privacy of his averted eyes while I took it in. £465,000, I said. Yes, he said. 2 years. Yes. I put the document down. I looked at the ceiling of the conference room, which was standard office ceiling tile, entirely neutral, entirely free of useful information. I knew every piece of medical terminology she used, I said. Every single piece. I checked it. It was all correct. I know, James said. That's what she understood. That checking the terminology was the thing I would do, and the terminology was never the lie. The lie was behind it. He nodded slowly. She didn't use medicine to confuse me, I said. She used it to convince me. There's a difference. Confusion, I might have questioned. Conviction felt like understanding. We met Ophelia, not because I had to, but because I needed to. in the way that you sometimes need to see something clearly with your own eyes, even when you already know what's there. She agreed to meet us at a cafe near her apartment. She came in and sat down and looked at me, and I looked at her, and for a long moment nobody said anything. She looked, I thought, like someone who had been expecting this conversation and had decided to receive it quietly, not defeated, resigned. There is a difference. You know why we're here, I said. Yes, she said. There are no records, I said. Not at Dr. Bernardo's clinic, not at any of the hospitals. None of the admissions happened. She looked at her hands. Your mother, I said. The ovarian cancer. Was any of it true? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, My mother has some health problems. Nothing like what I described. Your father, he has high blood pressure. He's fine. I sat with those two sentences. I'd paid £85,000 for cancer treatment for a woman with some health problems. I had paid £95,000 for cardiac surgery on a man with high blood pressure. Why did you use medical emergencies specifically? I asked. You could have used anything. Property, business, something I knew less about. She looked up at me. She said, very directly, because you care about medicine. Because when someone is sick, you don't question. You just want to help. I sat with that for a long time. Then I said, You're right. That's exactly what I did. James was watching me. I could feel him waiting to see what I would do next. I'm not going to pretend this was your fault, she said. It wasn't your fault. No, I agreed, but I have to understand my part in it, not for your benefit, for mine. We left the cafe 20 minutes later. I didn't look back. James walked beside me and didn't say anything for 2 blocks and then said, Are you all right? No, I said, but I will be, eventually. The formal report went to the Philippine National Police and to the NBI's Financial Crimes Unit. James worked with both, with help from the due diligence firm, and the case was filed with the documentation we had gathered. I was advised, honestly, that asset recovery was unlikely given the dispersal timeline and the account closure pattern. I accepted that without the anguish I might have expected. The anguish had already settled somewhere else. I filed a report with the Metropolitan Police in London as well, because the transfers had originated from my UK accounts. They were professional and thorough and similarly realistic about recovery prospects. I thanked them and let the process proceed without attaching my emotional state to its outcome. James stayed in Manila for the full 2 weeks we had originally planned. We walked the city together in the mornings. He is, at 41, in much better physical condition than I am, and he was patient about the pace. We ate well. We talked about his work, his marriage, his son who had just started secondary school and was, by James's account, alarmingly interested in chemistry, which made me feel something that wasn't quite pride but was in that family. One evening, on the balcony of my apartment, the city spread out below us in its relentless illumination, he said something I have thought about many times since. You know what I keep thinking about? He said. You spent 40 years establishing whether clinical evidence is genuine before drawing conclusions from it. That's literally what you did professionally, every day. Yes, I said. And she found the one context where you suspended that completely. Yes. Why do you think that is? I looked at the city for a moment. Because in research, I said, the subject doesn't have eyes. The trial data doesn't look at you and sound frightened. The evidence doesn't call you at midnight when you're sitting alone in a quiet house and remind you, without meaning to, of the last time someone you loved was in a hospital and you couldn't help. He nodded slowly. Anne, he said. Anne, I said. She didn't just exploit my professional knowledge. She exploited the one place where my professional knowledge has a crack in it, the place where the research became personal. We sat with that for a while. The city didn't care. The city just kept going. I am back in Cambridge now. The garden has been tidied. I finally got round to it this past autumn, 2 years overdue. The recipe cards are still on the kitchen board. The reading glasses are still on the nightstand. Some things I am not ready to move, and I have stopped judging myself for it. The financial picture is what it is. The pension from the MRC is intact. The property is intact. There is less in the savings account than there was, considerably less, and the retirement I had planned is the retirement I now have minus £465,000, which is a significant adjustment at 71. I have made it. I am making it. It is not catastrophic. It is not comfortable. It is the life I have, adjusted for the decisions I made. I have spoken about this experience publicly, once, at a seminar on financial exploitation of older adults that a colleague at the MRC helped organize. I told the story in the same sequence I have told it here. When I finished, a woman in the front row asked me what the protection was, what a person could do to avoid what had happened to me. I thought about it carefully. Then I said this: the protection is not knowing more. I knew enough. I knew the medicine better than she did. Ultimately, she knew enough to deceive me, which is a lower bar. The protection is not caring less, because that is not a protection. That is just a different kind of loss. The protection is a structural rule that does not have exceptions for emotional urgency. Before money moves, independent documentation comes, not summaries, not synopses, original records, directly from the institution, not through the person making the request. Full stop. No exception for urgency, because urgency is the mechanism of the fraud, not a justification for bypassing the protection. She said that sounded hard to do when someone you love is frightened. Yes, I said. That is exactly why it has to be a rule rather than a decision. Rules don't bend under emotional pressure. Decisions do. I drove home from that seminar on a Friday afternoon in November. The Cambridge streets were wet with rain and the leaves were coming down, and the city had the particular gray beauty that it gets in late autumn, which I have always loved. I let myself into the house and put the kettle on and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the garden. I thought about Ophelia, not with the anger I had expected to feel permanently, which has quieted more than I anticipated, more with a kind of slow comprehension. She was a woman with medical knowledge, financial pressure, and a precise understanding of how to read the people around her. She had read me accurately. She had found the place where my competence ended and my grief began, and she had worked that seam for 2 years with considerable skill. I do not forgive her for it. Forgiveness is a transaction that requires some acknowledgement from the other side, and I have no indication she has provided one. But I understand it as an act of human calculation, rather than as something that happened to me specifically because there is something uniquely wrong with me. I was a target because I was available, and because my particular vulnerabilities were legible to someone who knew how to look for them. That legibility, that is the thing I am working on. Not closing myself off. I am too old and too acquainted with what isolation costs to choose it as a protection. But learning to notice when the emotional urgency of a moment is doing the work that evidence is supposed to do. Learning to feel the pressure and name it, rather than letting it make the decision while I watch. Anne would have asked for the documentation on the first call. That is the honest truth. She would have asked warmly, caringly, and with full intention to help, and she would have asked before transferring a penny. She was a secondary school science teacher for 30 years, and she had, in the best possible sense, a natural immunity to being convinced by confidence alone. She always asked for the source, the primary source, not the summary. I have a note on my desk now. It says, "Ask for the primary source." It is the most important thing I learned in 40 years of research. It is also, as it turns out, the most important thing I forgot. The kettle boiled. The garden was wet and green in the November light. The house was quiet in the particular way that houses are quiet when they have been loved in for a long time by people who are no longer all there. I made my tea. I did not let it go cold. That, at 71, is something. That is, in fact, quite a lot.